Today we're going to look at a verse in Romans chapter 1, actually two verses, but there's a main part of the second of the verses. This is going to be verses 16 and 17. And the Apostle Paul talking about the gospel, but he quotes a verse from Habakkuk, which is really important. And I know I've referenced it before. So we're going to look at Romans 1, verses 16 and 17. And he says that, "For I am not ashamed of the gospel of Christ, for it is the power of God to salvation for everyone who believes, for the Jew first and also for the Greek." Okay, that's verse 16. So Paul says, I'm not ashamed of the gospel. The gospel means good news, and it is good news. And in the gospel, the good news declares the power of salvation, of deliverance, in being saved. And he says to the Jew first and then the Greek. Then there was an order. Just as Paul would go to different places, he would go to the synagogue and speak to the Jews first and then to the Gentiles, usually when the Jews kicked him out of the synagogue. And the ones that would follow and want to hear more in the synagogue so often were the ones that had converted to Judaism from among the Gentiles, the Greek nations anyway. So, it is the power of God unto salvation for all who believe. The word believe is significantly important. This is right at the core of this, because as he goes on in verse 17, he's going to tell us gives a very powerful statement, a quotation from Habakkuk. And so let's read the verse 17. He says, "For in it," in the good news, "the righteousness of God is revealed from faith to faith, as it is written, the just shall live by faith." And that statement, the just shall live by faith, is really important. But let's back up and think about the good news, the gospel. And the gospel, in it, he says, is the power of God for his righteousness. The power of God unto righteousness. And we're going to look at some other verses in Romans this week. We're going to see that the Apostle Paul is telling us that in the gospel is a message of righteousness. And righteousness can mean a couple different things. One of those is God is righteous. So he's bringing us into his very character and nature. And if we go back to Genesis, where we were not that long ago, but we didn't go all the way back to the beginning, God created us in his likeness and in his image. When we look in 1 John, which we'll do at some point, he tells us that we practice righteousness because we are born of God. God's righteous. He's our Father, and we are like our Father. That's why righteousness is included in this. This is part of the gospel. The good news is God wanting to make us like him, righteous. And the one I really want to emphasize, the part here I really want to focus on a little bit more, is the just shall live by faith. Now, faith, we have to understand, and we'll go to Hebrews 11, verse 1. We'll talk about what faith exactly is at some point. But faith fundamentally is, I'm going to believe. So notice when he said the gospel is the power of God unto salvation for all who believe. This goes back to the two trees in the garden we talked about. I want to believe God, no matter what. That is fundamentally important. Not believing my own interpretation, my own feelings, the way it seems, the way it looks to me, but what he says. That was the fundamental error, the mistake that Adam and Eve made. They chose to eat of the tree, which was, I will decide for myself. I don't want to decide for myself. I want to know that my Father, God, is good, and I'm going to believe him. And he declares that the just, those who are justified, because he is the one that justifies me, having counted me worthy and is pleased with me, he has justified me. We talked about Romans 5:1 in a different video. I have been justified. Justified, never sinned. But my life is in him, and I cannot live that life that he has called me to and that the gospel declares, except I live by faith, believing every word that comes forth from him. So when I am in that place of faith, trusting, following, confessing, thanking him for what he says, not what I feel and the way it seems, I actually find life. So a little thing to leave you with is we live by faith. if it feels like I'm not really living, discouraged, depressed, having a really hard time, feeling worn out, the corollary to this is that I am not living by faith. In fact, if I'm dying, it's because I'm not doing it by faith. The just live by faith.